Because we're short of time, I would give each about, a couple of minutes, max, maybe only a minute and a half, to be visionary, to say, put yourself back into that strategy unit. There is no economic crisis. There is no limit on funding. What, Mike, would you like to see done if you were in the strategy unit and the Prime Minister came to you and said, I finally understand there is a problem at 18 to 24 in terms of youth offending. What would you like me to do?
Thanks, John. That's really kind of you. I'll do 20 seconds on victim support and then come up with radical solutions.
Yeah.
I think the point that Sarah made earlier about the interaction you have with the police at a young age and the way that you interact with the criminal justice system at a young age is incredibly important here. And as a charity that works with about 1 million victims of crime and witnesses a year, we see that as incredibly important. And one of the things that we really struggle to do is to help young people, particularly in this kind of 16 to 25-year-old age, have an interaction with the criminal justice system that is a positive one. So if I could just ask everyone here that's been a victim of crime in the last 5 years to put up their hand. And if you had a positive experience in reporting that, keep your hand up. If you were contacted and know what happened in your crime, keep your hand up. Right, so that is the number of people in this room. About everyone here was a victim of crime that had a really positive experience with the criminal justice system. And if you are vulnerable 16 to 24, then you have a real problem if you don't trust the criminal justice system at the beginning. So in terms of what I do, as someone that works for a big charity involved in criminal justice delivery, it's okay if I just stick to what charities should do, really. The first is something that we're really, really struggling with, which is developing services that are attractive to young people between 16 and 25, and reaching out to them and putting in place a kind of brand in a way that people want to come and get support from. And I think actually the name victim support probably isn't very helpful for that. And this is some simple things like don't call from a withheld number ever to someone that's under 25 because they won't pick up the phone. I think there's lots of services we need to do about restorative justice, about various other kinds of thing. The second thing for volunteer-led organisations like us is get a volunteer base that reflects the kind of communities that you serve. So the vast majority of victims of crime aged between 16 and 21, there's more victims of crime aged between 16 to 21 than there are over 50. So getting a volunteer base that really works for that group and can structure activities and volunteering opportunities in a way that young people actually want. So it has to be more flexible, it has to have more development opportunities into it, and it has to be more fun than someone that's older. And then the third thing that I'd say, particularly for charities like us, and we are not good enough at it at the moment, is really capturing and understanding what the experiences of young people in the criminal justice system are like. So victim support deals with, as I said, 1 million people. We don't have at the moment yet a way of capturing those experiences in a systematic way that can go back to ministers and say this is what's happening in real time in the criminal justice system. And that for us is one of the biggest challenges that we face, and trying to really understand that, make it work and feed into projects like the one run by the Barracabi Trust is really important. So that's
thanks. That was a slightly long 2 minutes, but rewarded. Aubrey, some very original stuff has been done in New York. I can see that you started the coalface of the courts and move out. What have you got in a minute and a half?
Well, John, I think I'll try to answer your question by first of all saying that if the Prime Minister asked me how to change the criminal justice system, the first thing he'd probably wonder is, who is this guy with the American accent telling him what to do? And after he gets over that shock, I think I would say really two things. I think the first thing that's very important is about communications, in fact, and I think it's about injecting a note of optimism, actually, in opportunities for the criminal justice system to change. I think we have to fight against the tendency in the midst of fiscal austerity to fall into this sort of negative trap that change is not possible. I think, if anything, there are more opportunities in the landscape that we face. And I speak as someone who spent a year here trying to open a London office of the Centre for Justice Innovation and Effectiveness. For example, I think we should make more mention of the very basic fact that the youth incarceration rate has dropped by 1/3 in recent years. I think we all know, and it's widely reported, the adult prison population has doubled in the last 2 decades. Less widely known is some of the successes in the youth system, and I think there's a very basic problem there of communications. And then the second thing I would say, and this speaks to what does it mean to create a more healthy environment in which criminal justice reform and innovation can flourish. And I think there are 3 basic investments that are key to this process, and I'll very briefly sketch them out. I think one very important one is creating a criminal justice system where the focus is on the needs of practitioners and not on policymakers. And I think one of the drawbacks of a centralized governmental system is that practitioners spend a tremendous amount of time and energy satisfying the needs of central government policymakers rather than attending to kind of the realities of day-to-day implementation. And I think another thing I would say is that there's a tendency towards a debate dominated by kind of abstract ideas and less about what is it that makes for good criminal justice practice. And I think in a healthy environment you would move more towards a debate about practice. The second thing I would say is in a healthy environment you'd have a genuine commitment to local experimentation. Barrow Cadbury's pilots, I think, speak to that environment. And I think you would do 2 things. You would avoid the temptation to leap from a single pilot to full-scale institutionalization of various initiatives. I think that's a trap that has been fallen into often. And I think you would also, and this is, to my mind, kind of the key, find ways to create incentives for local practitioners to take on risk, to try new things. And importantly, those incentives don't always have to be based on money. They can be based on recognition or career advancement. And the third and final thing I would say is it's very important, I think, to try to create more of a learning culture in England and Wales. You know, there's been a lot of talk about the need to create the equivalent of a NICE or an Institute for Fiscal Studies in Criminal Justice. And I think that's a good idea, provided it's done the right way. And speaking very broadly, I think the challenge is to kind of find a middle ground between 2 equally unappetizing extremes. One is a world where policy is made by anecdote, or even the sort of instinctual decision of a minister. I think that we could define as a bad system. I think an equally bad system is one in which we have unrealistic demands for proof before we authorize action. And I think if we are going to create a learning culture, one that is, again, more focused on practitioners and their needs and their day-to-day realities, I think we have to walk a very fine line between those 2 extremes.
Great, thanks very much. Lucie?
I think, firstly, I mean, talking about mental health, what's really important in all of this is about good mental health and about helping children to develop good mental health. So I think we need to go right back and enable them to do that through schools, through developing resilience. You know, we've heard a lot about the kind of factors that will lead to the kind of behaviour that young people end up in the criminal justice system. So I think teaching resilience in schools is very important. The transition from children's services to adult mental health services is very problematic, I'm sure, as many of you know, and many young people who don't get that transition will get lost and will end up in the criminal justice system if they aren't already. And there are particular conditions such as things like ADHD and autism and certain learning disabilities and disorders where you'll see that more in the prison system, and this is because these young people have got lost and aren't getting the services that they need. I think there's a big issue, I mean this has been referred to a lot already about early intervention. You know, for many young people, they'll end up in yacht services rather than children's services because in children's services the threshold has got higher and higher over time. And so that's where they will get interventions when they actually should be having a range of completely different interventions. Localism and the localism agenda and the new landscape, well, let's all hope that it's positive. and that people are able to make local decisions and things work much better, but the jury is out at the moment. I think also very important in all of this is young people's voices and young people being involved in service design and delivery. You know, we as practitioners do not have all the answers. Young people have many of the answers. We need to be talking to them much more. And I think the mental health diversion schemes that do exist already, some of them are good, some of them are more varied. They need to be learning from each other, and there needs to be national standards in place.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I'll bring you, Susan, in once we get the questions going. Juliet.
Well, I'll try and be quick, which is difficult, because I think there are footholds in what everyone said, you know, and footholds in what we've heard this morning. We've heard about vulnerable young people, and we have to think about why do we lock up our most vulnerable people and our most volatile young people in our most barren institutions, I think. And I'd want the Prime Minister to think about that and think about what that costs, what it costs us in terms of actual money. I mean, the average is very much higher for that age group than the 45,000 average across the whole prison population. I agree with Aubrey that I'd want him to think hard about what gains have there been already in the 30% drop in the child prison population, which is a significant success. What that means in relation to shutting down the Youth Justice Board and the requirements to maintain a really sharp focus on children and young people, otherwise we'll lose a lot of those gains. I'd like him to think about the cycle of crime, the fact that in this country we have more children affected by the imprisonment of a parent than by divorce, which is pretty extraordinary. We do like locking people up, so that, you know, 7% of children are going to experience the imprisonment of a parent sometime when they're at school. That's remarkably high, actually. We know that parents have got parenthood, we heard from Kevin, has got older, but actually there are more young parents in prison. There's a tendency towards younger parenthood, and you can look at the young man at the back when you get a chance. He's a very tender young prisoner with his baby, and when you meet young people in prison, you don't find happy, healthy young people, but you often find young people with aspirations. They don't want to be there. They want a different kind of life. If they've got children of their own, they want a very different life for those children. And so there are footholds in the young people themselves who've got into trouble in terms of their hopes and dreams, in terms of their aspirations. What are the risks? The risks are that we're entering a climate where youth unemployment is rocketing, and that's going to be a very significant factor, I think. And you only have to look at, say, the apprenticeship schemes run by National Grid and the efforts to try and engage young people in employment where they work to see the gains that there can be made by, you know, the ordinary things, having a job, having some money, having a safe place to live. I think I'd ask the Prime Minister to focus very hard on young care leavers. How can we end up with young people going in for welfare reasons and then exiting the care system only to go into the justice system? There's something very wrong there, and that's a journey that really doesn't have to be inevitable, but currently that's how it works. I'd also like to say to him, look, you've got a green paper, which may be rather blind to this age group, but actually has a number of really important footholds for reform. It's got the foothold where we've got the Department of Health partnership with Ministry of Justice and a budget line from the Department of Health for diversion and liaison schemes for people who are mentally ill to get into the treatment they need, and for those with learning disabilities, which would respond in part to what Lucie was raising. So that, you know, there are a number of footholds, whether it's in the sentencing side, reducing use of remand, trying to reduce the number serving IPPs, very high number of young people in this age group serving IPPs. So there are footholds there, but take it seriously, support it, and watch what you say. Don't use words like, when you're talking about prisoners, that it makes you physically ill if you think they're going to vote, or it's offensive for sex offenders to want to review their treatment. Think about the messages you're giving publicly and marry up your social policy with your justice policy. The previous administration didn't, and that's probably where they failed. There's a chance for success here. And I think what Barrow Cadbury's done has been able to provide the kind of information to really underpin all of this, so that there's a really strong knowledge base to underpin this argument.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Juliet. Well, we've got 15 minutes before we go to coffee. You won't suffer, don't worry, we're just delayed slightly because we overran. But I thought the best word of the presentations there was opportunity. And this is an incredible opportunity because for the first time in a generation, we have a minister who wants to cut the prison population dramatically. And that must, in the end, impinge upon younger offenders as well. So who's got anything they would like to raise from the floor? Yes, Edwina.
I just wanted to ask, we're talking about young people a lot, and obviously most of the young people we're talking about tend to be in schools. Do you not think more should be done in schools? Should there be more education around all these topics?
Lucie?
Yeah, I think what I was referring to earlier on was teaching young people resilience and good mental health, which is all about developing self-control and empathy and understanding and restraint. And I think, it's not just schools, it's about parenting as well. And that needs to happen, from birth, pre-birth, because if we're going to help generations to develop in emotionally healthy ways, then if we do that, it means that young people will be able to, some of the things that you were talking about, the kind of things that, the risk factors, they'll be able to deal with better and become stronger and able to resist them and to move forward and to have happier and healthier lives. So I think, that's an essential thing. I mean, there's lots of work that going on in schools around knife crime and things like that, but I think it goes deeper than that. It's actually, I don't think schools should just be about teaching academic success. They should be about developing young people so that they can be healthy and happy individuals and less likely, as part of that, to commit crime.
Susan, you've looked at gang crime, knife crime, the rest of it. Is there any evidence that education, that schooling can interfere with your graphs?
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence that young people who have very negative school experiences are much more likely to become involved in longer-term patterns of offending. Partly the problem is partly a problem of labelling and stigmatisation in schools amongst young people who are not achieving academically as well as others, but also young people whose behaviour can become bad in school, which can be a reflection of other underlying problems. Those young people are quite often excluded on a regular basis, or they're sent to some sort of educational base where they receive very little education, or they might be brought back into school on a part-time timetable basis, and yet these are the kids that actually need more education, not less. So they slip back further and further, become more disadvantaged, more labelled and stigmatised, and they become very quickly disaffected with the school system. I think another problem that we have is that the school system at the moment doesn't recognise that not all children are or aspire to be academic. And that actually we don't have very many choices for younger children in this country for vocational choices, which is something that a lot of the European schools offer children. So young people, young boys in particular, who perhaps want to have a more practical approach in their career, in their longer term careers, of course that would require bringing back of much more placements for young people and what's the word I'm looking for? Where they go and start trades, apprenticeships, that's the word I'm looking for, thank you. But there's a problem with disaffection, but there's also a problem with what's offered to these children in the education system.
I spoke with a young pregnant teacher at the weekend who teaches a class of 5-year-olds in a primary school in Camden. And one of the 5-year-olds persistently tips the desks over, becomes extremely violent and difficult. And so the local authority have insisted that whilst she is teaching that child, there is a one-to-one teacher brought in to control the child, and the child begins to behave very much better. But as soon as the pregnant teacher is out of the classroom, the one-to-one support is taken out. So it's not a provision that is made for the child's welfare, but for the teacher's welfare, which of course is very understandable, but worth sustaining once you see that the results.
There's just one other thing about education, which is that once young children fall out of the education system, it's impossible for them to get back in. And actually many young people who go through particularly bad experiences during their mid-teenage years get to around about age 16, 17, and they want to come back to education, but there are too many barriers to prevent that.
Yes, in the front row here, and then I'll come back. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions and then we'll mix and match.
Hi, Carleen Furman from Bernardo's. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of the points that have been made already around how we get more young people to access support services that are out there, how we engage them in education and careers. And there seems to be a continuing gulf between young people who are either academic, as in kind of the maths, science, English, and young people who want to get involved in trade. And more we see that's boys who want to be builders and girls who want to be hairdressers, and that's all we're going to offer them around that. And actually, what young people's education on what it means to be part of a society, and what all of these structures like the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice and the National Offender Management Service and what they all do, and what services they're all meant to provide, and what that actually means in your local authority. Because if you ask any young person in a local authority what services exist in your local authority that you can access, they don't know what you're talking about. If you say, do you know X amount of thousands of pounds are spent on you to provide you with this range of services, they are dumbfounded. And actually, if we spent a bit more time engaging them in local service provision, actually explaining to them what the Home Office was, they might listen when we are discussing these things in the public domain and think that it's relevant to their lives, which is why you see programmes about guns and knives constantly being pushed into schools, because at least they hear those words and think, oh yeah, I know about that, I understand what that means. If you talk about strategic commissioning frameworks and CAM services, they don't know what you're talking about. And you need to be able to actually engage them from a very young age in what it means to have decisions made about you by other people who don't know what it is to live your life, and for them to actually want to engage in that service provision. And I'd like to know from the panel how they think they can play a role in actually enabling young people to not just be an advisory, not play an advisory role, not just volunteer, but actually be involved in design, delivery and leadership around these particular issues.
So not just big, but society. Yeah, very good. Let's yeah, over here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you, John. My name is Dominic Williams. I'm the Chief Executive at Revolving Doors Agency. My question's, I guess, mostly for Aubrey Fox, really. And I think in this debate, we're up against a media and a public point of view, which channels the kind of, I guess, the sort of justified anger that people feel when they've been a victim of crime. And that becomes exaggerated, and it becomes quite a negative. It's a very difficult narrative to have a debate with. And I'm curious about how this, in the United States, how you feel, whether that's shifting at all in the United States. And I think particularly when you talk about young people, is there a narrative about their needs, the background they come from, the issues that they face, developing there that might help us in terms of moving this debate forward?
And are you from the same organisation? You had a question? No. Right. Somebody did round here. One more question? Yeah, let me take you at the back then. Sorry.
John Cabin from the Prince's Trust. What does the panel think about encouraging more mentoring in the different services that they're talking about? So that the people that have direct experience of custody, or if they're a victim, or if they've been bullied at school, or have had trouble in the education sector, are actually being mentored by people that actually have the experience of going through that and helping those that are now on the receiving end.
Mike, why don't you pick up that final one?
That's actually the one I didn't want to answer. I think very simple. Yes, brilliant. We should do much more of it. We're not good enough at it. As a sector, we need to do more of it and make sure it works. The point was it Carleen? I think localism creates a real problem here. So one of the things that we're trying to work out is actually, what does public policy now mean? So if you're the Prime Minister and you sit in Downing Street, what levers do you pull that actually make things happen now? It's really not obvious, and it's not obvious in the criminal justice sector particularly. And I think one of the things about getting young people to be designed and involved in local services is a real challenge for the organisations in this room to say, actually, it's up to us to campaign locally, to persuade local politicians and local service delivery people to make the changes that young people want. And that is really about taking a really, really good example of something that works locally, like the pilots that Barrack Cadbury Trust is funding, and making a really powerful kind of local case about it. We've just got to be much, much smarter about it. So we can't pull levers at a desk in number 10. We have to do it much more locally.
Aubrey.
So, great question about how you influence media and public opinion. And I'll speak from my experience in New York, which is actually a relatively positive point. You have both crime and incarceration rates going down, which is a story that isn't often told outside of the United States, quite significantly in New York. And also fear of crime going down and greater public confidence in the criminal justice system. And you know, I want to be careful, I don't want to over-rely on an example from another country, but I think there are a couple of things that stand out about why we've moved in this more positive direction. And with respect to media and public opinion, I think the thing that stands out is that is the kind of person who is delivering the message about criminal justice matters. So in New York, what you find is a kind of rigorously nonpartisan and non-ideological message about what works and what doesn't, delivered by local practitioners who instinctively have greater credibility with the public. And I'm talking about local police chiefs, local probation heads, local prosecutors. Now, all of those people, importantly, have great incentives to carry that message. They may be elected officials, they may be people who are trying to advance their own careers, and so you find kind of incentive and positive public policy meeting. So I want to be careful to stress that those dynamics do not exist in the same way in England and Wales. But I think the point is that if you can create some version of that, if you can identify these networks of local people who do tend to have more credibility with the public, if you can help craft their message and you can help encourage them that sort of standing out, speaking out is not going to hurt their career, it's actually going to help their career, I think then you actually get into kind of a mutually reinforcing positive dynamic. Unlike the one that you have right now, I'll point out, where typically the only voices you hear in the media and public sphere, and there are a lot of great voices to be sure, are folks who are either central government policymakers or people who are somewhat removed from the day-to-day realities of local areas. And I think there's a sort of heavy discount rate over time to get supply to those voices.
A very quick round again from the floor. There's a question here, and then I'll come to you, and that'll be all, I'm afraid, just you two. Yeah.
Aubrey, on the communication, to me, it's all about, we can't change the past, we can change the future. So my team, for example, the juniors, the Barrington, the Elroys, are focused on just less victims of crime, and that's surely the best message we can get out there. The one great surprise to me is that none of the panel really grasped what I think is the key reason how you can break the cycle, which is about intensive support that's believable to those youngsters, support that's delivered by people they believe in, and support that is persuasive. And that was the great surprise to me.
Thank you very much. And yes. Mike here, please. Hand mic with the green. No need to be upstairs. Okay, go for it.
Is for Susan, really, to try and help me integrate some it's kind of illogical messages that I'm picking up really from different longitudinal studies at the moment. Yesterday at these, there was an early intervention conference up in Manchester, and there's very much a focus on family nurse partnerships and the fact that by targeting at-risk parents you can improve multiple outcomes for children. And yet what I'm hearing from you is that actually targeting at-risk children stigmatizes and pulls them into the criminal justice system. And I can't integrate those two messages at the moment. I think practitioners will also struggle with that. I wondered whether you could help us with that.
Susan, and then Lucie.
Yes, it's a complicated picture.
Only 1 minute for it.
Okay. The problem with targeting individual children or even individual families is that if you target that individual child or family within an area where there are other equally problematic families, then that resource is going to do very, very little, because those families and children are not just influenced by what happens in their own lives, they're influenced by the communities that are around about them. And that's one of the problems with targeting individuals. My key problem is, and it relates to the previous question as well, is that we make it a requirement for young people to break the law before they get the services that they need or get access to the opportunities that they need. And that's where actually a lot more family support, it needs to be mainstreamed. This needs to be mainstream services that's offered to everybody, not just the at-risk families, so that everybody can access it and nobody feels that they're being particularly stigmatised by having access to it.
I just want to refer back to Carlene's question, and I think involving young people is about providers letting go. I think this is a big power issue, and they have to be willing to take on what young people say, and I think we've got a long way to go, really, with that. Yeah, I was very interested in that answer because I think it is very difficult to understand how we deal with families which we know are very chaotic, and we know what's going to happen to the young people. We think it's very likely that what will happen to the young people within them. But yeah, maybe it is about targeting communities and not just families. That's interesting.
Juliet, say, have 10 words, why not? Subscribe now.
I think some of the themes are important. I mean, one of them is about personal responsibility and maybe restorative justice in schools, as well as, you know, we've been talking about restorative justice in the justice system, but they're experimenting in Somerset in schools with that. That's a way in which young people can become engaged, not as mini politicians, but as people who take responsibility and who sort things out for themselves. And I do agree with Rob about support, and it has to be support on the terms that it can be accepted. And that's often Chaplain and Prince's Trust, you know, mentored by someone who understands and has been through those things themselves. So I think a lot of the themes, you know, have actually joined up rather well.
Thank you very much. And I'd like on your behalf to thank the panel very warmly.